If you're enjoying listening to Reilly and I on the Eat More Carbs podcast, please consider reviewing our podcast. Make sure you're subscribed to the Eat More Carbs podcast wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts. This is the Eat More Carbs podcast. Hello and welcome to the Eat More Carbs podcast. My name is Jenna Fisher and I'm here with my co-host Reilly Beatty. Today, I'm going to be chatting with Reilly all about starting a private practice in nutrition and what that looks like. So I'm really excited to talk to her about that, kind of getting to pick Reilly's brain about all of that information for starting a dietitian business, for being in private practice, especially in sports. So if you're an RD-to-be or a dietitian or just someone who's interested in business, this is a great podcast for you. Before we get into some of the questions and topics that Reilly is going to share about today, we're going to do our high and low segment. So Reilly, can you kick us off?
So Jenna has seen a lot of this firsthand, but for my low this week, I wanted to kind of tie in another low that I've had recently where I've been really struggling to remember certain things being a new mom. And I've even shared on different episodes how I'll be practicing my lows in preparation for the podcast and I do forget them. So I took Jenna's advice and I started a list with my highs and my lows. My low is my low list is much longer than my high list. So I have been taking a lot of L's lately, and it is just really funny to me that I have like 10 to 15 lows and I have 3 highs. So that is my low for the week. One of those highs, though, that is on my little notes app, my little list, is that Charlie actually laughed for the first time yesterday, and it was like the cutest thing I've ever heard. So even though I do have less highs, I feel like that one counts for more because that was a very, very fun and cute experience.
Baby giggles are so cute.
So cute.
Okay, you're going to have to try your hardest to get it on film.
What about you, Jenna? What's your high and your low for this week?
My high, you'll definitely be able to tell when we're recording this podcast because of my high, but my high right now is that the Nuggets are making a comeback. I was really worried after game 1 and game 2 that we were out, but that is no longer the case, and I'm feeling good about that as someone who grew up in Colorado. Even though I'm maybe not the biggest like basketball fan or anything like that, like I always cheer for Colorado sports, so I am cheering for the Nuggets because of that. I'll always cheer for the Cavs because I lived there too, and I love Darius Garland, but that's besides the point. So I'm excited that the Nuggets are not out of the series yet. My low took place yesterday morning. It is now in the 90s for the highs in Scottsdale. So marathon training, running after work is not a thing because at that point in time, it's too hot. And as I've shared before, I am an uncomfortable, unhappy, warm person. So I need to run in the morning. My husband and I went out for a run yesterday morning. We ran along this path. It's pretty heavily trafficked as far as like walkers, bikers, runners, and things like that. Runs along a golf course. And as we're running, the man walking in front of us starts to glance over to the side like multiple times. And I was like, what is he looking at? Like, that's weird. And I look over, and as we're running, there's a coyote running towards us. And it just keeps coming closer and closer and closer. And we're perpendicular to the coyote, and it's running towards us, and we're running in front of its path. And it just got really, really close. And not that it was to the point where I was like, I'm scared this coyote's going to attack me or anything like that, but it was just way too close for comfort for me, where I was like, that is very close to me as a wild animal. So kind of cool to see it up close, I guess. But at the same time, I was not expecting to see it out on a golf course at like 6 in the morning. So
You probably got a PR though, right? You had to run really fast. That's what always happens to me.
that's my high and low. If you haven't heard already, Reilly and I are going to be launching our first ever private practice cohort where we want to chat all about business with other nutrition professionals and RDs to be. So in honor of us launching this new cohort, we're going to be talking all about business, starting a business, being in private practice, and sports nutrition. So Reilly, how long have you been in private practice?
So we have been in full-time private practice for, it will be 3 years in October of 2024, which is wild. You know from being in the dietetic internship with me that I was always trying to do private practice, even, 5 years ago, but full-time have been in private practice for the last like almost 3 years.
I can say in full confidence that when I met Reilly, she had the most entrepreneurial spirit of anyone that I've ever crossed paths with in the dietetic field. I knew like day one, she wanted to be in private practice and she wanted to be in sports one day. And getting to watch Reilly from her time in the internship all the way to where we are now with RBSN has been such a cool thing to watch. But like, what were the first steps you took in identifying like what you wanted to do in private practice and sport?
I always knew that I wanted to be like an entrepreneur. I just like love the freedom of being like an entrepreneur, and there's no ceiling with that. And I think that is so fun because there's so many different things that you can do being in private practice. But I also knew I wanted to work in sports first. And then I just didn't know how they would necessarily, come together. So knowing that I wanted to, be an entrepreneur, have my own business, and then also wanting to work in sport, I started almost like parallel pathing, like trying to come up with a private practice while also pursuing my career in sports because I just didn't know how they were going to intertwine. So I did a ton of things in the beginning. The first thing was at least like starting my Instagram account when I was still a student. I wasn't giving out like nutrition advice or medical like nutrition therapy or anything like that, but I was just establishing my presence online and making a ton of mistakes while doing it.
Making those mistakes, but learning from those mistakes is one of the most valuable things that we can do. I think we even talk about it still that we're going to be learning from the mistakes that we make and from the successes that we have even now. But what is like your biggest takeaway for somebody who wants to be in private practice for identifying like what type of business or what path they should be in? You knew you wanted to be in sports from the very beginning, and that's a lot to do with like your background. But for someone who maybe doesn't have that same niche or that same area, like what's your tips for them for kind of figuring that out?
I think you have to first figure out like why you want to go into private practice. Like what is your reasoning personally for going into private practice? And it doesn't have to just be one thing, but like what are you truly trying to accomplish with a private practice? Because I think so often, and I definitely made this mistake, is we're skipping steps and we're not working on like that foundation, just like with our nutrition, right? We have a fueling foundation. And when we're starting a private practice, we also have to be focusing on like the foundation of that private practice or that business and not jumping ahead because that foundation is going to be what everything is based off of.
I think being online and being a dietitian, I see a lot of stuff about being in private practice and other dietitians in private practice. And it looks like this very glamorous, very easy thing to do. Before I got into the private practice space with you, I just had this idea of what it looked like. Would you recommend that somebody kind of dream big and like create a big picture of what like the end goal is for their private practice, or to kind of start at like those first beginning steps? What are the first beginning steps for putting together a private practice? Like, do you start big, start small, create a vision board? Like, where do you start?
I think a combination of both because yes, we want that goal that we're going to strive towards, that big, overarching picture. But if we're not figuring out like our little tangible steps to achieve that, we're never going to get that big picture, right? Like you and I can sit here all day and have these like beautiful vision boards, which we do, right? But then if we're not setting little goals to help us accomplish that overarching goal, we're never going to get there. Additionally, I think too, you have to just be super flexible with it because I think we talk about all the time how there's just so many things about owning your own business, being in private practice that you never really realize until you jump in full time. So it's amazing to have big goals. And we definitely see a lot of people online who are like, I make $100,000 a month. And it's like, you don't just jump there immediately. So figuring out again, like your overarching big goal, but then having little goals to help you accomplish that big goal. And that big goal kind of circling back should be based off of like the why you're trying to go into private practice, right? Are you trying to go into private practice because you want location freedom or you want more financial freedom or you want to help a different population of people, you want to expand your reach? There's so many different reasons and you have to figure out your why so you can set up your practice to help meet that.
That's such a great piece of advice because I think for so many of us, we have this overarching like end goal that looks really fun and we just think about that, but we don't really break that down into the tangible things like identifying our why for going into business in the first place to help us get there. Like what's the reason for that? And I think it kind of goes back to we always talk about in nutrition like identifying the why behind someone's habits. We have to identify our own why, which can sometimes be a little bit daunting or a little bit difficult. What's your tips for identifying a why? Like how did you figure out your why and how did you go from there?
First of all, like you identify your why, but then also being like flexible for your why to change. So the why when I started my business might look very different than my why now because I actually started my business in May of 2020, just seeing clients and athletes like in the evenings and on the weekends, in addition to my full-time collegiate job, because I was actually really nervous that I was going to lose my job because I was in Los Angeles during COVID and everything was shut down and college athletics was, really up in the air. So I was worried that either people in my department were going to get cut, I was going to get cut, or just, maybe get a pay cut that was something that people were talking about. So I did it for almost like self-preservation at the time. And my why now is very different from my why then. Therefore, like our practice has changed based off of my why.
I think that's huge, is being able to be flexible with your why. We need to be okay with the fact that the why might change, which might change other things about the practice too. When it comes to who you're working with, has that changed at all throughout the entire time you've been in private practice?
Honestly, no, I don't think so. I think a big thing is like, I love sports nutrition so much and I love working with athletes. And something that I've been really lucky to do is basically take the clientele that I was working with in my full-time positions and now work with them in my practice on my terms.
If you are a dietitian or an RD to be that doesn't have that who you're working with really dialed in like you did, you had a really easy transition from going from working with athletes, working in the collegiate world, over to having a private practice in sports nutrition. But if you don't have that, where's a good place to start? Like, what should be kind of be the questions you should be asking yourself in order to identify like who you're working with in your private practice?
It goes back to that why again, I think. So, for an easy example, because we love examples, it makes it a little bit more clear. If you're maybe going into private practice because you love to travel and you want location freedom, right? You want to be able to live anywhere, you want to be able to work anywhere, then you need to build your practice around location freedom, right? So, you don't want to set up a brick and mortar because then you're going to be tied to a certain location. You don't want to, you live in Arizona, there we talked about this the other day, you're not going to promote a bunch of content that's Arizona specific if someday you don't want to live in Arizona or you want to be traveling or you want to be, working from wherever because your clients are going to be specific to Arizona. They're going to maybe expect you again to have a brick and mortar in Arizona. And from there, then you kind of start looking at the clients that you're maybe attracting, or you look at your networks, or you look at how you can help individuals based off of your why.
So, really, it kind of comes back to the why and the who. Like, those are your two big questions when starting the private practice and really thinking about like who's the intended audience, who do I want to work with, but also why do I want to work with them, and what's the purpose of my nutrition business. So you brought up the idea of like thinking about marketing for things in Arizona because that's where I live. But when you were in California, California has a lot of like California specific restaurants, has a lot of California specific grocery stores. There's an extremely expensive one where everybody wants to go and get their smoothie right now, but you wouldn't necessarily be talking about those things or how an athlete could utilize those restaurants or those grocery stores to fuel because your reach is so much bigger. And when you're working in sports, you want to think about the chains, the bigger places that are across the board, maybe familiar with students when they travel, or if they're an athlete that travels, where we can have access to those things. So all of that kind of dictates too, not only like your social presence, but like what you're talking about with athletes because you're not specific to California.
Yeah. And then also too with the who, I don't know if I really answered your question earlier, but something that we do a lot of here at RBSN is like look at the data, like look at data, try things out with figuring out who you want to work with. Like try working in the beginning with lots of different people and seeing what you like and seeing what works for you. And again, like doing surveys and gathering data, like in analytics, using that information to help pave your path.
Going into the analytics and looking at all that data and understanding how that might influence your pivot in private practice is one of the things I know you're going to talk about during our private practice cohort to make sure everyone understands how to kind of take the numbers and apply that to private practice, which I think is so valuable. But it's another reason why we've decided to launch this private practice cohort in the first place. We're not walking away from nutrition coaching and talking with athletes, talking with active individuals, but we were seeing a lot of influx of questions from other dietitians, other RDs to be about what we were doing in order to make sure that we were able to continue the coaching that we do with clients and athletes. So kind of pairing those two things together. And like I said, we're not walking away from coaching and nutrition or anything like that, but we're also expanding. And that's another thing that private practice can allow for too, is that expansion to cover more topics or to cover more areas. So is that something that you have seen throughout the past 3 years?
Yes. And I've found, and I've definitely made this mistake too, but almost like pivoting too fast, trying too many things, not looking at the data. A big thing that I hear so many people say is like, I want to do passive income and like, I want to make a course. And I'm like, great. We love that. We all want passive income. But as a high school student who already goes to class 7 hours a day, are they going to watch a course? Are you launching maybe a free course and you're seeing, who's even joining that? Like, just again, like looking at some of the data, like that's going to be something that we're talking about.
which again, I think is incredibly beneficial. And a lot of the things that you have taught me is how to interpret that data, even for myself, because although we both work in nutrition coaching, some of the smaller details between who I'm seeing as a client versus who you are seeing is just slightly different. So, how do we continue to build and grow and make sure both of those things are accounted for, knowing that we both want to make sure that all of those people are taken care of within our BSN?
Yeah, because it's just like nutrition coaching, like making a business, because just like with our clients, it's super individualized. And I think sometimes we forget that when we are trying to like navigate this space.
For someone who's listening, who's a dietitian, RD to be, anything like that, who wants more information on this cohort that we're going to be launching in June, how can they find out more information?
You can check out our website, ReillyBeauty.com. It should be the first web page that is up on the menu. And we're also listed down below, so you can apply. We are doing invite only, so every application will be reviewed by us, and then we will be reaching out to you for like a Zoom call if we feel like you're a good fit.
All of that information will be left in the show notes of this podcast, so that way you can easily find us and ask us more questions. So, from everything that you've just shared, what I'm gathering from that are top 3 things to focus on when looking into starting your private practice. One, I would say that there's never a bad time to start in private practice, and there's always opportunity and room for someone else to come into the private practice space. When you're first starting out, yes, you want to dream big and have the idea of what you want your private practice to look at, but make sure you're identifying your why behind why you want to be in private practice. Sit down with pen and paper, write about who your intended audience is and why you want to work with them. And identifying those things are a good starting point to launching into private practice, or just to give you the starting points of working up to being in private practice full time. We have to dream big, but then pare those things down in order to start the tangible goals. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Eat More Carbs podcast, where Reilly and I chatted all about her starting a private practice in sports nutrition. If you have additional questions for Reilly and I, you can always leave them below, or you can find us on Instagram. We're at the Eat More Carbs podcast. You can find Reilly on Instagram at riley.beatty.nutrition, and you can find me at jenna.fisher.nutrition. Thanks again for listening. Please make sure you rate, subscribe, and review. And as always, remember to eat more carbs.